A man is given only months to live, but the true death sentence in his heart is for the loyal old dog who has never left his side. He has one final, impossible mission: to find a safe harbor for his friend before the winter and his life comes to an end. This is the story of that mission, a journey of profound love and sacrifice. We believe powerful stories like this deserve to be heard, and by taking a moment to like, share, and subscribe, you become a vital part of our mission to ensure these tales of loyalty find every heart that needs to hear them. Now, our story begins in the cold, quiet woods of Maine. The cold in rural Maine was not merely a thing of the weather. It was a presence, an entity that seeped through the thick log walls of the cabin and settled deep into a man's bones. Arthur Williams felt it in his 72-year-old joints, a familiar ache that had become the rhythm of his winter days. Outside, the world was a silent tableau of ghostly white. The pines heavy with snow, their branches bowed in solemn reverence. Inside, the only answer to the oppressive silence was the crackle and spit of the fire in the stone hearth and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the dog at his feet. Max, a German shepherd of 13 years, was a magnificent creature even in his old age. His thick coat was the classic black and tan, but his noble muzzle was frosted with the white of a long life, and his gait carried the telltale stiffness of aging hips. He lay on the worn rug before the fire, his head resting on his paws, but his amber eyes were open, fixed on Arthur. He was a sentinel, a silent partner in this self-imposed exile. Arthur reached down, his hand trembling slightly as he stroked the dog's broad head. Max responded with a low rumble, a purr-like groan of contentment that was the cabin's most comforting sound. It was a language they had shared for over a decade, a communication that transcended words, forged in the quiet aftermath of losing his wife, Mary, and solidified in the long, lonely years that followed. But today, the familiar comfort was tainted by a gnawing dread. The appointment with Dr. Albright in town was at 2 o'clock. Arthur had been putting it off, blaming the increasingly treacherous roads, but the rattling cough that shook his frame each morning had become too violent to ignore. With a sigh that turned to vapor in the cool air of the room, he pushed himself up from his armchair. Max's head lifted instantly, his ears perked, his gaze questioning. "It's all right, boy," Arthur rasped, his voice rough. "Just a trip to town. I'll be back before the storm hits." The drive was slow, the old Ford truck skidding occasionally on the icy patches hidden beneath the fresh layer of snow. The world beyond his windshield was beautiful and unforgiving. When he finally arrived at the small clinic, Dr. Albright, a kind man with tired eyes and a gentle, direct manner, was waiting. He led Arthur into the small examination room, the scent of antiseptic sharp and sterile. After reviewing the latest scans on the glowing screen, the doctor turned to him, his expression somber. "Arthur, the fibrosis has progressed more rapidly than we'd hoped," he said, his voice soft but clear. "The scarring in your lungs, it's extensive. At this stage, there isn't much more we can do." Arthur stared at a spot on the wall, his mind a sudden, hollow void. He had known, of course. He had felt it in the way. Each breath became a conscious effort, a battle for air. Still, hearing the words spoken aloud felt like a final sentencing. "How long?" he asked, the question barely a whisper. Dr. Albright hesitated. "It's hard to say for certain. A few months, maybe less, with the cold putting such a strain on your system. I'm truly sorry, Arthur." The drive home was a blur. The doctor's words echoed in the silence of the truck's cab, each one a hammer blow against the fragile peace Arthur had constructed for himself. He saw nothing of the snow-laden trees or the gray sky. He saw only the end of a road. Max, sitting faithfully in the passenger seat, seemed to sense the shift. He whined softly, a low, anxious sound, and nudged Arthur's arm with his cold nose. Arthur placed a hand on his head, the familiar feel of the thick fur, a grounding presence in his spiraling thoughts. It was not his own death that brought the hot sting of tears to his eyes. It was the dog. When they returned to the cabin, the wind had picked up, howling through the pines and driving the snow in a horizontal frenzy. The storm had arrived. Arthur stood before the large window, watching the world disappear into a churning vortex of white. The cabin, once his fortress of solitude, now felt like a tomb. What would happen to Max? The question slammed into him with the force of the blizzard outside. Who would care for an old dog with stiff hips? A dog who only knew the love of one man. He thought of the shelters, cold and crowded, and a wave of nausea washed over him. Max came to stand beside him, pressing his body against Arthur's leg. A silent offering of support. Arthur looked down at his loyal friend, then at their reflection in the dark glass of the window. He saw a frail old man and a faithful dog, two figures silhouetted against the raging storm. In that moment, as the blizzard raged and his own life felt like it was being torn apart, Arthur made a silent, solemn vow. It was his final mission. Whatever it took, whatever the cost to his own breaking heart, he would not let Max face the cold alone. He would not let his best friend, his last connection to a life of love and loyalty, simply fade away into the winter. The great blizzard had passed, leaving the world reborn in a blanket of pristine, impossibly deep snow. In the quiet aftermath, every sound was muffled, every edge softened. For Arthur, however, the silence was heavy with the weight of the promise he had made to Max. It was time to act. He pulled on his thickest wool coat, his movements slow and deliberate, while Max watched from his place by the hearth, a low whine escaping his throat. The dog knew. He always knew when something was amiss. "Easy, boy," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. "We're just going for a ride." The old Ford truck protested the cold, its engine turning over with a groan before finally catching. The main roads had been plowed, but they were still treacherous, lined with towering banks of snow. Their destination was the county animal shelter, a low concrete building that seemed to absorb the gray light of the winter sky. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of disinfectant and animal fear. A young woman with a tired expression and a faded blue sweatshirt stood behind the counter. Her name tag read, Brenda. Arthur explained his situation, his words careful and measured, trying to convey Max's gentle nature, his quiet loyalty. Brenda listened with a practiced patience that did not quite reach her eyes. "I understand, sir," she said, her tone flat. "Can I see him?" Arthur led Max in from the truck. The dog stayed close to his leg, his tail low but not tucked, his gaze scanning the unfamiliar, noisy environment with dignified apprehension. Brenda looked him over, her eyes noting his graying muzzle and the slight favor he gave to his left hip. "He's a handsome boy," she admitted. And for a moment, a sliver of hope warmed Arthur's chest. But then she sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. "Look, sir, I have to be honest with you. A senior German shepherd, especially one with developing hip issues, is a difficult placement. A very difficult placement. We're already at capacity with younger, more adoptable animals. He could be here for months, even years. We just don't have the space or resources for that kind of long-term maybe." The word maybe hung in the air, cold and sharp. It was a death sentence delivered with an apologetic shrug. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. He nodded slowly, unable to form a reply, and turned, leading Max back out into the biting wind. The rejection was worse than he had imagined, not because of its cruelty, but because of its cold, simple logic. In a world of limited resources, an old dog was a bad investment. He drove away from the shelter with no destination in mind. the truck's tires crunching a lonely rhythm on the packed snow. The sky, which had been clear, began to cloud over again, and a light flurry of snow started to fall, dusting the windshield. The finality of the doctor's words, the tired indifference in Brenda's eyes, the vast, cold emptiness of the future. It all crashed down upon him at once. A tightness seized his chest, a familiar, terrifying pressure that stole his breath. He was suffocating. Gasping, he wrenched the steering wheel to the side, pulling the truck onto the snow-covered shoulder of the deserted road. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cold steering wheel, each ragged breath a painful battle. Max, sensing his master's profound distress, began to whine, pawing frantically at the passenger door. In his panicked, breathless haze, Arthur fumbled with the latch. The door swung open, and Max leaped out into the swirling snow. But he did not run. He took a few steps, then lay down on the frozen ground beside the truck, a silent, unmoving guardian in the storm. He curled his body against the wind, his head up, his eyes fixed on the truck door, waiting. When Arthur finally managed to draw a steadying breath and lift his head, he saw the image through the snow-streaked glass. His magnificent, loyal friend, lying patiently on a bed of ice and snow, uncomplaining, his entire being focused on one thing, waiting for him. The sight shattered what little composure Arthur had left. A raw, guttural sob escaped his throat. It was a portrait of pure devotion, a love so absolute it was willing to endure any hardship, and he, in his weakness, was failing it completely. After a long moment, he gathered the strength to call Max back into the warm cab. The dog was shivering, his thick fur dusted with a fine layer of white. Arthur wrapped his own worn coat around the dog's trembling body as he drove the final, silent miles home. Back in the cabin, by the roaring fire, he toweled Max dry, his hands working mechanically, while his mind replayed that image on the roadside. Max, though cold himself, nudged Arthur's hand, licking away the tears that traced paths through the wrinkles on his weathered face. It was in that simple act of comfort that Arthur felt the full, crushing weight of his helplessness. He had set out to save his friend from the cold, cruel world, only to be reminded that in the end, it was Max who was still trying to save him. The days following the trip to the shelter were a quiet, gray purgatory. Arthur moved through his cabin like a ghost, the weight of his failure, a physical presence. The unspoken promise to Max echoed in the silence, a debt he did not know how to pay. He spent hours just watching the dog, memorizing the way his ears twitched at the sound of a distant bird, the contented sigh he let out in his sleep. Each small detail was a fresh stab of pain. Then, the radio, which had been murmuring in the background, delivered a new verdict. A voice, calm and serious, spoke of a historic blizzard moving in from the north, a storm of the decade that would paralyze the state for days. The announcement cut through Arthur's lethargy. There was no more time, no more days to search, no more nights to wrestle with his conscience. The storm was a deadline, and it was less than 24 hours away. His mind, once a fog of despair, sharpened with a single, desperate objective: Sunrise Ranch. It was a place he'd only heard about, a sanctuary for veterans nestled a few hours away. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble on the shared, unspoken bond of service. It was his only shot. The preparation was a solemn ritual. Arthur pulled a sturdy canvas backpack from his old army footlocker. Into it, he carefully placed 2 cans of Max's favorite wet food, a bag of beef jerky, and a worn, much-loved tennis ball. Finally, he sat at his small wooden desk and wrote a letter. His hand, usually unsteady, moved with a newfound purpose. He didn't write about his illness or his impending death. He wrote about Max. He wrote about the dog's bravery, his quiet intelligence, his hatred of thunderstorms, and his love for sleeping with his back pressed against the hearth. He wrote of 13 years of unwavering loyalty. He signed it simply, Arthur Williams, a friend. He folded the letter and placed it in the bag. The drive was silent. The sky was a heavy, uniform gray, and the air had a strange, electric stillness, the world holding its breath before the storm. Max sat in the passenger seat, not whining, but watchful, his gaze shifting between the road ahead and Arthur's grim profile. A few miles from their destination, Arthur pulled the truck over to the side of a deserted, tree-lined road. The first delicate flakes of snow began to drift down, melting against the windshield. He turned to Max, his heart a heavy, aching stone in his chest. "Well, boy," he began, his voice thick. From the inside pocket of his coat, he withdrew the object he had carried for over 50 years. It was a small brass compass, its surface worn smooth with the touch of his thumb. He opened the lid, revealing the faint, hand-carved inscription inside. "So you can always find your way home, Mary. Your Grandma Mary gave this to me," Arthur whispered, holding it for Max to see. "Before I left. She said it would always point me home. And it did, boy. Through all that mud and darkness, it always brought me back to her." A tear escaped, tracing a path down his weathered cheek. He did not wipe it away. "Now it's your turn, my friend. It's your turn to find a home." His fingers, clumsy with cold and emotion, fumbled with the sturdy leather lace he had prepared. He reached over and carefully, reverently, tied the compass to Max's thick collar. The cool metal rested against the dog's warm fur. It was done. The guardianship had been transferred. He leaned over and pulled the dog into a fierce, final hug, burying his face in the thick fur of Max's neck, inhaling the familiar scent one last time. "Be a good boy," he choked out. He drove the last few miles in a daze. The entrance to Sunrise Ranch was a simple wooden archway, its name carved with care. It looked peaceful. The snow was falling faster now, the wind beginning to stir. He parked, got out, and opened the passenger door. He led Max to the wide, covered porch of the main building, placing the backpack beside a wooden bench where it would be sheltered from the worst of the storm. He knelt, looked into those intelligent, trusting amber eyes, and felt his heart tear in two. He couldn't say another word. He simply placed a hand on Max's head, then stood up, turned, and walked back to his truck, without looking back. Each step was an act of will, a brutal severing. He did not see Max stand up, whining softly. He did not see the compass glinting faintly in the dying light. He only felt the cold as he drove away, his own lonely figure in the old truck quickly swallowed by the swirling, all-consuming white of the oncoming storm. The world was born again in silence and blinding white. The great blizzard had exhausted itself overnight, leaving behind a landscape of impossible beauty and profound stillness. Sarah Carter stood on the porch of the main lodge at Sunrise Ranch, a mug of coffee warming her hands, her breath pluming in the frigid air. At 32, she moved with the quiet competence of a soldier, a trait from her years as an army medic that had never left her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her observant, hazel eyes scanned the pristine expanse of snow, checking for damage. It was in this sweep that she saw it. First, a lump of canvas nearly buried by the drift against a support pillar. And then, a few feet away, him. Huddled under the deepest part of the awning was a German shepherd, his fur dusted with fine snow. He was not panicked or barking. He was simply watching her, his posture alert, his gaze steady and intelligent. Sarah set her mug down. Her training and her instincts told her this was no ordinary stray. She approached slowly, her movements calm and non-threatening. The dog did not growl, but he did not relax either. His eyes tracked her every step. As she got closer, she saw the object hanging from his thick leather collar. It was an old, brass military compass. Her breath caught. She had seen items like this before, talismans carried by older veterans, objects steeped in a history she could only guess at. "Hey there, buddy," she said softly, extending the back of her hand. "Where did you come from?" The dog, Max, considered her for a long moment before giving a low, hesitant whine. He leaned forward and gently sniffed her hand, his cold nose a brief, trusting touch. That was all the permission she needed. Her gaze went from the compass to the nearby canvas backpack. She carefully unbuckled it. Inside, atop neatly folded cans of food and a worn tennis ball, was a letter in a sealed envelope. She pulled it out and read it. Right there in the biting cold, the words of a stranger painting a vivid picture of love and desperation. She read about a loyal friend, a good boy who hated thunderstorms, and a life of quiet companionship. By the time she finished, her own eyes were stinging, not from the cold, but from the raw, selfless love contained in the old man's handwriting. This wasn't abandonment. This was a desperate act of sacrifice. "Arthur," she whispered, looking at the dog. "Your man's name is Arthur." She looked at Max, who whined again as if in confirmation. A fierce resolve hardened her expression. "All right, Max, let's go find your person." Back inside the lodge, her determination was a quiet fire. She knew the tight-knit veteran community in this part of Maine. A name, a service history, it was more than enough. She made a call to the VFW post in the nearest town, speaking to an old quartermaster named George. "Arthur Williams?" George's voice crackled over the line. "Sure, I know Art. Haven't seen him in years. He keeps to himself up on the old coastal road, after his wife Mary passed. A good man. A real quiet man." Within the hour, Sarah had a location. The snowplows had cleared a path on the main roads, and her truck was more than capable of handling the rest. Max sat in the passenger seat, no longer a lost dog but a partner on a mission. He seemed to understand, his gaze fixed on the road ahead as they drove through a world that sparkled under the brilliant post-storm sun. It was a landscape of hope. The cabin was even more isolated than she had imagined. A small, weathered structure overlooking the steely gray Atlantic. A thin tendril of smoke curled from its chimney. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation, and knocked on the solid wood door. For a long moment, there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. She heard a slow, shuffling sound from within. Then the click of a bolt being drawn. The door creaked open to reveal a man who looked like a ghost. Arthur Williams was gaunt, his skin pale and translucent, his eyes hollowed out by a grief so profound it seemed to have carved canyons into his face. He stared at her, his expression blank with exhaustion. Then, his gaze dropped. He saw the magnificent head of the German shepherd, standing faithfully by her side. "Max!" The name was a fragile, broken whisper. Disbelief warred with a dawning, impossible hope on his face. Max could not contain himself. A joyful, frantic bark erupted from his chest, and he surged forward, past Sarah and into the cabin. Arthur stumbled, dropping to his knees on the worn wooden floor, his arms wrapping around the dog's neck as Max covered his face in wet, ecstatic licks. The sounds that came from the old man were not words, but raw, choked sobs of overwhelming relief. He buried his face in Max's fur, his thin shoulders shaking. Sarah remained on the doorstep, giving them their moment, a silent witness to a love so powerful it had battled a blizzard and won. The sunlight streamed into the small, dark cabin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A brilliant, hopeful light that seemed to chase the shadows from every corner. The sun had returned, and it had brought a friend home. The great Maine winter did not release its grip all at once. It yielded slowly, grudgingly, in a long, wet thaw. The oppressive silence of the snow was replaced by the gentle sound of dripping icicles and the gurgle of newly freed streams. For Arthur, the change of season mirrored the thaw in his own heart. Sarah's presence had become a quiet constant in the weeks following Max's return. She would stop by every few days, bringing groceries, sharing a cup of coffee, and simply talking. She never spoke of his illness, but her friendship was a balm, a quiet acknowledgement that he was not alone in his final days. One afternoon, as the first green shoots began to push through the damp earth, she made her proposal. "Arthur," she began, her voice gentle, "I've been thinking about Max. I don't just want to give him a home when the time comes. I think he has a job to do." She explained how Max's innate calm and steady presence were a rare gift. "There are young men and women at the ranch who are still fighting their own wars inside," she said. "Sometimes the quiet company of a good dog can reach them when nothing else can. Max has a purpose waiting for him." And so, on a mild spring day when the air smelled of pine and damp soil, Sarah drove Arthur and Max to the ranch. Arthur was weaker now, leaning heavily on a cane, but his eyes were clear. The ranch was alive with the sounds of spring. He saw a small group of veterans sitting on the wide porch of the lodge, their conversation muted. One young man, who couldn't have been more than 20, sat apart from the others. His name was Leo. He had a tense, haunted look about him, his hands clenched tightly in his lap as he stared at nothing. Sarah didn't say a word. She simply opened the truck door and let Max out. The old dog, invigorated by the fresh air, trotted onto the lawn, his tail giving a slow, dignified wag. He took in the scene, his intelligent eyes assessing the group. Then, ignoring the others, he walked directly toward the solitary young man. Max didn't jump or bark or demand attention. He approached Leo slowly, lay down near his worn combat boots, and rested his great head on his paws with a soft sigh, as if to say, "I am here." Arthur watched, his breath held tight in his chest. For a long, silent minute, Leo didn't move. Then, slowly, hesitantly, his clenched hand unfurled. He reached down and laid his trembling fingers on Max's thick fur. The dog didn't flinch, only leaned into the touch, almost imperceptibly. A profound, shuddering sigh escaped Leo's lips, and the rigid tension in his shoulders seemed to melt away, just for a moment. In that quiet, sacred interaction, Arthur felt a peace so complete, it was like a physical weight lifting from his soul. He finally understood. Max's love would not be an orphaned memory. It would be a legacy. It would live on, healing others long after he was gone. The weeks that followed were a gift. Arthur made several more trips to the ranch, each time growing a little weaker, while the world around him grew more vibrant. He watched as Max became the quiet, unofficial soul of the place. He saw his old friend bring comfort not just to Leo, but to others. His steady presence, a silent anchor in their turbulent lives. The fear that had haunted Arthur for months was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding serenity. He passed away on a warm night in early June, peacefully in his own bed, the scent of summer blossoms drifting through the open window. Sarah found him the next morning. He had a faint smile on his face, and Max was lying on the rug beside the bed, a faithful guardian to the very end. The story does not end there. It continues in the warm summer sun at Sunrise Ranch. It continues in the way Max greets new arrivals, his calm demeanor immediately putting them at ease. It continues in the afternoons he spends with Leo, the two of them walking the trails through the woods, two quiet souls finding their way together. And sometimes, when Sarah walks with him through the fields of wildflowers, the sun will catch the old brass compass still hanging from his collar. It glints and shines, no longer just a memory of a love that was, but a living beacon of a love that endures, a promise fulfilled, a loyal heart still guiding others home. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't about holding on, but about letting go in a way that gives new purpose. Arthur's final mission for Max became a legacy of healing that outlived his own days, a quiet reminder that loyalty, once given, never truly ends. it simply finds a new heart to comfort. If stories like this, which celebrate the enduring power of the heart, resonate with you, we hope you'll consider joining our community. By subscribing, you help us continue to find and share these quiet reminders of the good that still exists in the world.